When the hooded figures arrived to execute her in 1871, the woman they sought to silence had already identified 3 of them by the way they bled 9 years before. This took place late one night in a tobacco barn outside Greensboro, North Carolina. 40 Klansmen in white robes surrounded a single black woman. They anticipated fear and flight. They did not anticipate the quiet smile that crossed her face. These men, expecting to suppress a dangerous rumor, instead found someone who had been patiently waiting for their arrival. The local authorities erased every trace of that night. Official records mentioned nothing but a routine property inspection. Before we uncover the true story of the woman they called the Greensboro Ghost, what do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Make sure to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Drop a comment and tell me what state you're listening from. I love knowing where our audience discovers these forgotten chapters of American history. The path to that bloody night began 300 miles south, in a place where the history of the Civil War was carefully distorted. Charleston County, South Carolina, was notorious, not for its wealth, but for its specialization in psychological brutality. The great Tidewater plantations perfected the dark art of rehabilitation, taking the most dangerous or rebellious enslaved individuals and forcing them into perfect compliance. Havford Plantation, established in 1789, and now owned by Colonel Augustus Havford, was the unchallenged master of this practice. Havford paid a premium for runaways and those with excessive spirit, and his meticulous ledgers boasted a chilling success rate. No successful escape attempt in 23 years. The woman arrived at Havford on March 3, 1862. Her name was scrubbed from the record, but the bill of sale noted her approximate age was 19, and her past included a history of violence toward overseers. She was already a killer. She had taken a man's life in Beaufort. Colonel Havford's clinical assessment was unnerving. She was tall, and her hands were strangely calloused. Not from domestic work, but from something else entirely. Her first and most immediate crime at Havford was simply refusing to look down when spoken to. Her indoctrination began in the training house, a separate brick structure where the colonel personally oversaw the breaking of spirit. After 31 days inside, she emerged, changed, outwardly compliant. She possessed an unusual, almost superhuman stamina in the fields and was soon moved to the plantation's medical facility. The official record grows deliberately vague here. As a medical attendant in the sick house, she demonstrated an almost supernatural understanding of anatomy. She could set fractures with precision and identify diseases before they fully manifest. When questioned about her knowledge, she offered no explanation. She seemed unable or unwilling to speak of her past. Colonel Havford, despite his cruelty, recognized supreme value and provided her with basic medical texts. But the steady march of the war soon shattered this arrangement. By November 1862, Havford's sick house was suddenly converted into a Confederate field hospital. The woman found herself surrounded by the very men fighting to maintain her bondage. The first 17 Confederate casualties, overwhelmed by skirmishes near Pocataligo, arrived. The resident physician, Dr. Marcus Bellingham, was instantly out of his depth. He was competent for civilian fevers, but the gruesome military wounds, bulls, rampant infections, exposed organs were beyond his experience. The woman from Beaufort worked the first 3 days without rest. Dr. Bellingham watched with unease as she moved between the wounded with impossible efficiency. She knew instantly which men were beyond saving and which needed immediate intervention. She extracted bullets with steady hands, maintaining a clinical detachment that the doctor later described as examining livestock rather than treating the men fighting for a cause. On the 4th day, Private Edmund Vickers developed a high fever and confusion. Standard treatments were applied, but the woman, unnoticed by Bellingham, made a subtle adjustment to his dosage from a small bottle she kept hidden. Private Vickers died that night, his death attributed to sepsis. 3 days later, Corporal James Lindsay followed the same trajectory, dying within 18 hours despite treatment. The woman prepared his body personally. By December 12, of the original 17 soldiers were dead. Bellingham attributed the high mortality to severe wounds, but he missed the chilling pattern. The 5 survivors had minor injuries. The 12 who died included 7 men whose wounds, while serious, were not immediately life-threatening. 3 of the dead had been officers. Fresh casualties arrived in January 1863, and the selection process continued. The Havford sick house became a revolving door of dying Confederate soldiers. The mortality rate did not raise suspicions, because field hospitals across the South were equally overwhelmed. What made Havford different was the subtle, selective paterna process so carefully managed that even the victims didn't realize what was happening to them. In February 1863, Captain Theodore Winscott arrived with a clean, non-life-threatening bullet wound to his leg. Winscott was educated and observant. On his third night, heavily medicated, he witnessed the woman preparing his evening dose of laudanum. He noticed a pause, a glance towards the door, and a subtle addition to the mixture from an unlabeled bottle in her apron pocket. Winscott pretended to swallow the medication, then immediately spat it out. He recognized the cold, clinical assessment in her eyes. When she offered him the cup, the same detachment he'd seen in a pharmacist mixing rat poison, Winscott began to watch her. He noted how rapidly some patients deteriorated despite treatment, while others, with worse injuries, mysteriously stabilized. He noticed the small bottles of tinctures she claimed were herbal remedies, but which he never saw Dr. Bellingham approve. On February 28th, Winscott reported his suspicions to Colonel Havford, who politely but firmly dismissed the claim. The colonel declared the woman trustworthy and attributed Winscott's concerns to paranoid delusions from his injury. Winscott recovered fully and was sent back to his regiment, but not before warning to surviving soldiers, Lieutenant Hornsby and Private Strickland, to watch their treatments. Both men laughed off the warning, calling the idea absurd. 2 weeks after Winscott's departure, Lieutenant Hornsby died of sudden cardiac failure. Private Strickland suffered a mysterious paralysis that crept upward over 3 days until his lungs stopped. Dr. Bellingham was baffled, attributing the deaths to contaminated water. The woman prepared both bodies without comment, her face showing only the appropriate solemnity. As the war intensified, Havford's hospital expanded. Dr. Bellingham, overwhelmed, relied entirely on the woman to manage day-to-day care. Colonel Havford began showcasing her 2 military officers as a loyal slave supporting the Confederacy, never allowing her to speak to visitors. The death toll continued to climb, with a clear, but unnoticed, pattern. Officers died more frequently than enlisted men, educated men more often than illiterate ones. In August 1863, a Union raid forced a temporary relocation of all Confederate patients. The woman remained, working in the regular sick house, now treating only enslaved workers. For 6 weeks, the stream of dying Confederate soldiers stopped. Colonel Havford noted a subsequent, curious increase in productivity among his workforce during this period. Fewer people sick, faster recoveries, and no mysterious deaths. Meanwhile, the military hospital in Columbia noted no unusual mortality rates among the transferred patients. In fact, several soldiers who had been deteriorating at Havford began to improve. An army surgeon commented on the vague uneasiness patients felt at the plantation. When Confederate casualties returned to Havford in October 1863, the lethal pattern resumed immediately. The first to die was Major Robert Cunningham, a harsh plantation owner from Georgia, who succumbed to what Dr. Bellingham termed catastrophic organ failure. The woman from Beaufort attended him personally through his agonizing final hours. Cunningham died with a terrifying recognition trapped behind his paralyzed tongue, and she closed his eyes with unwavering fingers. By December 1863, the total death count at Havford had reached 87 soldiers. This alarming number was ignored because, in the failing Confederacy, mass death was simply the accepted reality. What the Confederate medical department could not know was the method, a system perfected over a year that killed slowly enough to mimic natural disease, but quickly enough to prevent recovery. The woman used native low-country plants oleander, water hemlock, and percoweed, each death appearing to be a different complication of war wounds. The winter of 1863 brought a change that would eventually expose everything. Colonel Havford fell terminally ill from a liver condition. Control passed to his wife, Alilanina Havford, who trusted her husband's systems entirely. In March 1864, the Havford's son, Lieutenant Charles Havford, arrived home with a minor arm wound. He should have healed quickly, but instead developed a puzzling, spiking fever. The woman attended him, bringing specialized teas. On the 7th night, delirious Charles grabbed her wrist and whispered the accusation. "You're killing me, aren't you? Like you killed the others." Mrs. Havford, watching from the corner, finally saw what her husband had been too arrogant to notice. The pattern, the deaths, and the subtle flicker of satisfaction on the woman's face. When certain patients took their final breaths, Mrs. Havford immediately stopped the woman from treating her son alone, and Charles recovered within days. Over the next 2 weeks, Mrs. Havford secretly reviewed her late husband's meticulous medical logs. The numbers were damning. Out of 143 Confederate soldiers treated, 94 had DIDA, 65.7% mortality rate. When examined closely, the distribution was horrifyingly clear. Officers had a 78% mortality rate, and educated, wealthy soldiers died at a far higher rate than poor farmers and laborers. The woman from Beaufort had been selectively killing the Confederacy's leadership class. Mrs. Havford confronted Dr. Bellingham as she walked him through the specific causes, the subtle discrepancies in treatment. The inexplicable sudden death stout shattered his professional certainty. He realized he had been an unwitting accomplice to nearly 100 deaths, because the idea that an enslaved woman could systematically murder Confederate soldiers under his supervision was so absurd. He'd never considered it. Bellingham wanted to notify authorities, but Mrs. Havford faced a different calculation, exposing the truth that Havford Plantation had been the site of mass murder facilitated by her deceased husband would destroy the family's reputation and lead to property confiscation. The entire legal system, which viewed the woman as property incapable of committing murder, had created the blind spot she exploited. On April 2, 1864, Mrs. Havford made her decision. The field hospital closed immediately. Dr. Bellingham resigned, haunted by his role. The woman from Beaufort would be sold immediately to a buyer as far from South Carolina as possible, with all records quietly altered to obscure the damning patterns. On April 5th, the woman was informed of her sale, showing no reaction. On April 8th, the slave trader, Jasper Crenshaw, arrived. Mrs. Havford told him only that the woman was unsuitable for plantation work and needed to go where she would have no contact with white people beyond basic supervision. Crenshaw understood. Move the difficult problem far away. He had a buyer in Tennessee looking for field workers. No questions asked, no history required. The woman from Beaufort left Havford Plantation on April 10th, 1864, in chains. The sale was finalized for a mere $800, a fraction of her true worth, but Mrs. Havford's priority was silence. In 25 months, she had murdered 94 Confederate soldiers, a secret that would be dismissed as impossible for years to come. As the wagon rolled away, witnesses swore they saw her smile, not in acceptance, but in triumph over her victims. What her former owners and Dr. Bellingham did not know was that she had spent 16 months not just killing, but meticulously studying the Confederate war, machined their tactics, weaknesses, bureaucracy, and medical systems. Havford Plantation had become her personal academy of warfare. Jasper Crenshaw's wagon never reached Tennessee. The slave trader's body was found 8 days later in a ravine, his throat cut with the controlled stroke of a professional, not the wild slash of a runaway. The woman, the horses, and 3 other enslaved people were gone. Confederate authorities ignored the incident. They had larger concerns as Sherman's army began its march. What followed exists only in fragments of forgotten reports. Between April 1864 and April 1865, Confederate records noted unusual casualties that could not be attributed to Union action. Officers dying in their sleep, small patrols vanishing, soldiers found dead at their posts with no signs of battle. Intelligence officers suspected deserters, but never considered the true source. A killer who gained access to secure camps by traveling with convincing forged papers as a free black nurse, Sarah Bridge. Desperate Confederate commanders, prioritizing medical aid, often ignored irregularities. Captain Theodore Winscott, who had tried to warn others at Havford, encountered her again in September 1864 near Atlanta. Now, a major commanding a supply depot. He recognized her immediately. The height, the cast in her left eye, the precise way she moved. She maintained her persona as the displaced nurse until Winscott spoke the names of the dead, mentioning the pattern at Havford. "You know what I am?" she said quietly, her accent now educated and refined. "You know what I've done? The question is what you're going to do about it." Winscott faced an impossible choice: expose her and risk shattering Confederate morale with the news that enslaved medical workers were systematically murdering patients. Or let her go continue her campaign. He officially arrested her, but the detention facility was minimal. By morning, she was gone, and the sergeant assigned to guard her was found dead, strangled before his body was burned. Winscott reported the escape but concealed the full scope of her history. In his private journal, he admitted the truth. He had let her go. He had seen a certainty in her eyes that terrified him more than Sherman's army, the absolute, patient certainty that the Confederacy would fall, and that she would personally hasten its collapse. Through the rest of 1864, the mysterious reports continued. Field hospitals losing patients to unexplained organ failure. Military physicians being told not to waste time on investigating vanishing medical workers. When the war ended in April 1865, the Confederate records were scattered or destroyed. The woman who had killed at least 94 soldiers at Havford, and an unknown number afterward, vanished for 6 years. Then, in October 1871, reports emerged from North Carolina about a tall black woman with a distinctive cast to her left eye, living alone on a small property near Greensboro. She was independent, purchased the land without visible means of support, and carried herself with an air of confidence that local white residents found deeply unsettling. Veterans sometimes recognized her as the nurse who had almost killed them in a hospital tent. The stories were dismissed as wartime delusions. The Ku Klux Klan, however, took interest. Her independence, her property ownership, and her lack of fear were intolerable to men trying to rebuild white supremacy. They decided to make an example of her, unaware that the woman they planned to terrorize had killed more Confederate soldiers than entire Union regiments. They had no idea that she had spent the 6 years since the war's end, not running or hiding, but waiting. The 40 Klansmen, led by the former Colonel Benjamin Pritt, surrounded the woman's isolated property at 11:30 p.m. They were veteran soldiers, confident in their tactics of terror. One lamp burned in the front window. When they advanced, the front door opened instantly. The woman stood silhouetted in the light, unarmed. She didn't flee. She scanned the approaching figures with the chilling clinical assessment she once used in the sick house, a gaze that made hardened raiders feel like cattle. "Evening," she said, her voice clear. "I wondered when you'd come." Pritchard raised his rifle to command silence. In that instant, she moved. The speed was impossible. She was off the porch, disarming Pritchard, and driving the rifle stock into his face with anatomical precision. As two other Klansmen rushed her, she dropped one with a leg sweep and paralyzed the second with a focused blow to the solar plexus. The remaining 37 men stood frozen, their confidence shattered. She retreated inside and instantly locked the door and latched the shutters. Gunshots tore through the walls, but she answered immediately from a north window, shattering a Klansman's kneecap. The Klansman soon realized the horrifying truth. She had multiple, preloaded rifles positioned at every window. This was not a victim. This was an ambush. Former Major Hastings finally found his voice, screaming the truth. "It's her from Havford! She killed almost 100 of our boys during the war. 37 now," her eerily calm voice called out, against someone who's been killing Confederate soldiers for a decade. "How many of you want to be next?" The standoff lasted 4 hours. The psychological warfare worked. 40 raiders were reduced to a confused, paralyzed mob. She selectively disabled 7 more men, aiming deliberately at limbs, confirming that she possessed both the skill and the restraint to kill them all, yet chose not to. Around 3 a.m., the barn was torched, revealing 11 men down with serious wounds, and one man, Turnbull, bled out. Lieutenant Petan Despa stood up and walked into the open. "We're leaving," he called. "We're taking our wounded, and we're going. We won't come back." "How do I know you'll keep that promise?" she asked. "Because you could have killed us all by now and didn't," Petan replied. "Because you were selective. You let the common soldiers go home." The door opened. She emerged, rifle held low, looking at the faces she recognized. "I counted," she said quietly, 187 at Havford. "And after, plus 23 tonight would be 210. But I don't need to hit 210. You only killed 187. One man objected. She gave them the chilling smile that became her legend. I'm rounding up for a psychological impact. The exact number doesn't matter as much as the message. There are consequences for what you did, and I was those consequences. Go home. The Klansmen retreated, carrying their dead and wounded. The woman watched them go, then returned inside to erase the evidence. The local record shows only a routine property inspection, but the truth was carried out in whispers among the survivors. The story leaked, despite everyone's best efforts to contain it. It started in smoky back rooms, where former soldiers gathered to relive their glory days. A man who'd been at the raid would have too much to drink and let slip a detail. Way she'd moved impossibly fast. The details leaked in whispers. A veteran recalling her unsettling competence. Another remembering patients dying too often in her care. The pieces didn't connect immediately, but over years, a terrifying pattern emerged in the collective memory of men who realized they had escaped the war at all. Former Major Wayne Scott heard these whispers throughout the 1870s. His journal entries documented no fewer than 17 separate accounts of veterans encountering the same woman in different Confederate medical facilities. Descriptions: the height, the distinctive eye, the unsettling competence, the pattern of death matched. 2. Precisely. When Scott began his own investigation, cross-referencing sightings with Confederate casualty records, what he discovered was chilling. In multiple locations where the woman was reported, the official casualty records showed anomalies. Most tellingly, wherever she appeared, lieutenant-level and higher casualties increased by an average of 42%. When Scott never published his findings, the implications were too explosive for a South desperately constructing the lost cause mythology, admitting that a single enslaved woman had systematically murdered hundreds of Confederate soldiers through trusted medical care would shatter the romantic myth of faithful slaves. Scott kept his research private, adding to it obsessively until his death in 1889. His notebooks filled with documentation and tortured moral reasoning about his own complicity. The woman herself remained on her property for 3 years after the confrontation. Her existence, her very survival, became a threat to the violent restoration of white supremacy. In the spring of 1874, a delegation of 3 respected black community leaders visited her. "Your war is over," the minister said carefully. "Ours is just beginning, and it's a different kind of war, one that requires survival, not revenge." She listened, acknowledged their struggle, and 2 weeks later, she sold her property for less than market value. She left North Carolina in May 1874. The woman from Havford Plantation vanished from documented history. Conflicting reports placed her in Philadelphia as a midwife named Sarah Bridgewell, or in Chicago running an informal clinic, or even traveling to Liberia. This absence is telling. It suggests someone who had become expert at existing in the gaps between official documentation, erasing her trail completely. The institutional response to her story revealed how deeply it threatened the established narratives. When Northern newspapers printed sensationalized accounts, the United Confederate veterans issued vehement formal denials, dismissing the Greensboro Ghost myth as Union propaganda. Their detailed refutation inadvertently confirmed much of what they were trying to suppress. Dr. Marcus Bellingham's widow discovered his private papers detailing the full scope of the Havford deaths, but she chose to keep them private, fearful of the repercussions. The papers were later dismissed by historians as the confused ramblings of a man suffering from war trauma, unable to comprehend the calculated cruelty he had witnessed. Only recent historical scholarship, beginning with a 2003 dissertation and a 2015 book on Black resistance, has begun to piece together the fragmented evidence, concluding that, while exact numbers can't be verified, substantial evidence suggests a black medical worker did kill Confederate soldiers deliberately over an extended period. What remains indisputable is this: someone existed who terrified Confederate veterans enough to suppress her story for decades. Someone skilled enough in medicine and murder to kill systematically without detection. She proved that even the most oppressive systems contain vulnerabilities that determined individuals can exploit. The last documented reference to her appears in a 1901 letter from a Philadelphia physician describing an elderly black woman he'd consulted. When he asked where she'd trained, she smiled and said simply, "The war taught me everything I needed to know." If this was indeed the same woman, she would have been in her late 50s, still practicing medicine, still surviving on her own terms. This mystery shows us how easily history can be erased when when it challenges comfortable narratives, and how acts of resistance can be systematically dismissed as impossible. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there deeper truths still hidden in the gaps of the official record? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. The past isn't always what we've been told it was, and sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happened.